Allison Marsh had always believed that education was like sunlight, something everyone deserved a share of, something that could chase away even the darkest loneliness. At 69, her own life had settled into a pattern as gentle and repetitive as rain tapping on a window. Most afternoons, she tucked a few worn textbooks under her arm, tied her thin scarf against the breeze, and made her way to Sunny Brew, the small, family-owned cafe where the scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee drifted like memory through the air. She ordered one modest cup of black coffee, no cream, and found her usual spot near the back, where the light from the window broke softly across her table and lit the brittle pages of her books. It was a small life, measured in sips and chapters, but it was hers, and it was enough. At first, nobody paid her much mind. She was simply the quiet older woman with the glasses that slid down her nose, scribbling notes in the margins of battered textbooks. A fixture, like the creaky door hinge or the faded support local poster in the window. Then, one chilly afternoon, a boy approached. Maybe 10 years old, with a backpack almost bigger than he was, and eyes that flickered with a combination of fear and hope. He hovered awkwardly at the edge of her table, clutching a worksheet in trembling fingers. Without speaking, he slid the paper toward her, and Allison smiled the kind of smile that lives not in the mouth but in the heart. She moved her coffee aside and gestured for him to sit. After that, it was as if a dam had broken. Another child came the next day, and then 2 more by the end of the week. Word spread silently, as it does among those who have few safe places left. Children with missing homework, fractured learning, and questions too heavy for their small shoulders began to gather at Allison's table. They came because they sensed what all wounded creatures sense instinctively, where the kindness was. Sunny Brew, once a place of muted conversations and solitary work sessions, began to hum differently in the late afternoons. The corner where Allison sat bloomed into a small, unofficial classroom. Children sat cross-legged on the floor when chairs ran out. They pored over fractions, conjugated verbs, and traced trembling cursive letters onto lined paper while Allison moved from one to the other, offering a steady hand and quiet encouragement. Her thermos of coffee grew cold most days, forgotten amid the sea of notebooks and eager, anxious faces. Still, Allison stayed, feeling, for the first time in years, that her life, her knowledge, her presence, mattered beyond herself. But kindness often unsettles those who measure worth by order and quiet. It started as a ripple. A pair of regular customers, irritated by the soft murmur of children reading aloud, asked to move to a different table. Another complained that the back corner had become an eyesore, cluttered with backpacks and scribbled worksheets. Their words floated through the cafe like invisible smoke, staining the air with discontent. Darrell, the owner, a good man burdened by the fragile economics of small-town business, noticed. He saw the handful of customers who left without ordering a second coffee. He saw the careful, uncomfortable glances exchanged over the rims of cups. One evening, just as the last child had packed up his worn folder and waved goodbye, Darrell approached Allison. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his apron, his face lined with the tension of a man caught between right and necessary. He crouched a little, so their faces were level. "Allison," he began, his voice gentle but weary, "I've been getting some comments. About the noise. About the space." He hesitated, as if hoping she might somehow interrupt him and take the burden of the conversation away. But Allison only listened, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I'm not saying you have to leave," Darrell continued. "Not yet. But if it keeps getting bigger." He trailed off, letting the unfinished sentence hang between them like damp laundry. Allison nodded slowly. She understood. Of course she did. She had lived long enough to know how small kindness could look under the harsh fluorescent light of inconvenience. "I'll do my best to keep them quiet," she said. Darrell smiled, but there was a shadow behind it. They both knew that doing her best might not be enough. After he left, Allison sat for a long moment in the empty cafe. Her coffee had gone stone cold. She sipped it anyway, feeling the bittersweet chill run down her throat like a memory of warmth already leaving. The next day, she rearranged the children, breaking them into smaller groups, whispering when she explained equations, using gestures instead of words where she could. She led by example, making her own voice a soft current beneath the louder tides of the cafe. Still, the space around her seemed to shrink a little each day. She noticed how conversations grew quieter when she entered, how heads turned just slightly when a child laughed too loudly at a joke she made. She caught the flicker of irritation in the eyes of a man stirring his cappuccino, the whispered exchange between two women by the pastry case. There were mornings she considered staying home, telling herself that maybe the children didn't need her that badly. Maybe someone else would step in. But then she would remember Tyler, the boy who had clutched his math test with both hands, grinning from ear to ear because he had earned his first A. She would remember Sophia, who once scribbled over her own work in frustration and now beamed shyly whenever she spelled a word correctly. She would remember their faces, not polished or perfect, but brave and hungry for something more than the world had yet offered them. And so, day after day, Allison returned to Sunny Brew with her bag of battered books and her one small coffee. She returned even as the corner grew lonelier, even as the weight of disapproval pressed harder against her back. Because some things are heavier than loneliness. And because Allison Marsh had already decided, somewhere deep in her quiet heart, that sunlight should be shared, even if it meant standing alone in the shade. The warnings, at first, were like light raindrops tapping against a window, small, almost ignorable. But raindrops, left unchecked, can turn into a flood. The complaints continued to pile up, quiet but persistent. Some customers left pointed reviews online, noting the unprofessional atmosphere and the classroom noise that disrupted their coffee rituals. Others made subtle remarks at the counter, suggesting the cafe was losing its charm. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, just the slow, relentless erosion of patience, like the sea pulling grains of sand from beneath a standing stone. Daryl did what he could to shield Allison at first. He posted signs politely reminding patrons that Sunny Brew welcomed all members of the community. He adjusted the furniture, creating a semicircle of tables in the back to contain the little classroom. He even offered free muffins to disgruntled customers in hopes of softening their complaints. But small businesses balance on thin wire, and the tension grew heavier with each passing day. The cost of kindness was starting to look like bankruptcy. On a Thursday afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray and the children's voices buzzed quietly over fractions and paragraphs, Daryl called Allison into the kitchen. The kitchen smelled of yeast and burnt coffee grounds. It was the place where Daryl hid when the world outside felt too heavy. He stood by the sink, his hands plunged deep into his pockets, staring at a crack in the tile as if it might offer an answer. "I hate doing this," he said after a long moment. "I really do." Allison waited, the thin strap of her worn book bag slipping down her shoulder. "I had a call this morning," Daryl continued, his voice brittle. "From the head office. They've been watching the reviews. They're worried about the brand." He said the word like it tasted bitter on his tongue. He turned to face her then, and for the first time, Allison saw fear in his eyes, not anger, not annoyance, but fear. Fear of losing what he had built, fear of letting down his family, fear of becoming another boarded-up storefront on Main Street. "They said if we don't deal with it," Daryl said, "they'll pull support. Higher rent. Less supply credit. We won't survive it." There was no need for more words. Allison understood. She looked down at her shoes, scuffed brown loafers that had walked thousands of miles in quiet service, and nodded. "Tomorrow," Daryl said, "will have to be the last day." He tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth trembled. "I'm sorry, Allison. I really am." That night, Allison sat at her small kitchen table, her textbooks spread out before her, a cup of cold tea untouched at her elbow. Outside, the wind scraped against the window, and the stars hid behind thick clouds. She felt the loneliness settle into her bones, heavier and colder than it had in years. She thought about the children, their bright eyes, their tentative questions, their small victories. She thought about the way Tyler's face lit up when he finally understood long division, about the tremor in Sophia's voice when she first read a paragraph aloud without stumbling. Who would catch them now? But self-pity was a luxury Allison had never afforded herself. Instead, she picked up a battered notebook and began to scribble down names, assignments, little notes about where each child needed help. She told herself that somehow, some way, she would find another place, another corner of the world where they could keep learning. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would smile. Tomorrow, she would make it a celebration, not a funeral. The next afternoon, Allison arrived early. She wore her best cardigan, the one with the tiny pearl buttons, and set up her table with extra care. She lined up pencils, laid out worksheets, arranged chairs in a hopeful semicircle. She wanted everything to be perfect. The children came in twos and threes, sensing that something was different. They clutched their notebooks tightly, casting nervous glances at Allison's unusually bright smile and the strange set of Daryl's mouth behind the counter. She gathered them around and explained gently, simply, that today would be their last lesson at Sunnybrew. That it wasn't their fault. That she was proud of them, proud beyond words, and that learning never ended just because a room grew silent. Some of the younger ones cried quietly. The older ones tried to be brave, their mouths pressed into tight, thin lines. When the lesson ended, the children hesitated at the door, reluctant to step back into a world that had once again proven itself fickle and fragile. They shuffled out, one by one, each turning back for a final look at the woman who had made them believe, if only for a little while, that they were seen, heard, and capable. Outside, they stood in a small, silent huddle, their notebooks clutched to their chests like armor against a storm. Allison watched them from her chair, her hands folded neatly on the table. She did not cry. Instead, she sipped her coffee, now cold, and traced her fingers lightly over the table's worn wood grain, as if memorizing it one last time. She stayed until the light faded and the cafe emptied. When she finally rose, her legs stiff and her heart heavy, she took a final glance around the place where so much quiet hope had bloomed and withered. The bell above the door gave a small, mournful jingle as she left. And outside, the town moved on, unaware, uninterested, unchanged. Or so it seemed. The days that followed blurred together, heavy and hollow. Allison Marsh was not one to wallow in despair. After all, she had lived through lonelier seasons, widowhood, retirement, the slow fading of friendships that once seemed permanent. She had learned that life rarely offered explanations, let alone apologies. Still, as she sat in her small, neatly kept apartment, staring at her stack of worn textbooks, the silence pressed against her like a second skin. She spent the weekend searching for a solution. The public library seemed a natural choice. Allison arrived early Monday morning, a hopeful gleam still flickering in her tired eyes. The grand old building, with its carved stone lions and stained glass windows, smelled of dust and forgotten stories. It had once been a second home to her when she was a little girl clutching a library card like a passport to another world. She met with the head librarian, a thin, brisk woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. The rules, the woman explained, were very clear. Children under 12 needed parental supervision. Tables had to remain quiet zones. No tutoring sessions larger than 2 students at a time without prior written approval. And of course, no gatherings in the reading alcoves, fire code regulations. Allison smiled, nodded, thanked her, and left. Outside, the first breath of winter rode the wind, tugging at the hem of her coat. She tried the park next. Under a bare, skeletal tree in Willow Lane Park, she set up an impromptu classroom, a plastic folding table, a thermos of hot cocoa, a handful of folding chairs borrowed from her closet. A few children trickled back, their loyalty stronger than their parents' doubts, but the open air brought its own cruel obstacles. On the third afternoon, a sudden downpour sent papers flying and soaked the children's work beyond saving. On the fourth, the mosquitoes came in clouds, biting and buzzing until even the most determined gave up, scratching miserably at their arms and ankles. Attendance dwindled. Tyler, once so eager, missed 2 sessions in a row. Sophia came but lingered only briefly, shivering and swatting at insects before whispering an apology and running home. Each day Allison packed her bag a little more slowly, her steps heavier as she made her way back to her apartment. The worn textbooks, once filled with scribbled notes and corrected worksheets, began to gather dust again. The thermos stayed warm longer, no small hands reaching for it with laughter or thanks. The town of Laredo moved on. In the cafes and grocery stores, and the pews of Sunday services, the chatter was about the upcoming fall festival, the price of gas, the new boutique opening in Lakewood. Very few remembered the old woman and her small corner classroom at Sunny Brew. Fewer still wondered what had happened to the children who once found refuge there. Some nights, Allison would sit at her window with the light off, watching the town go to sleep. Porch lights flickering off one by one. Curtains drawn. The darkness settling in. She wondered if kindness was like smoke, visible for a moment but destined to vanish into the air, leaving no trace behind. She wondered, too, if she had been foolish to believe otherwise. Still, she couldn't stop herself from trying. A few flyers pinned to the bulletin board at the grocery store: free homework help. No fees. All ages welcome. A cautious conversation with the community center director, who mumbled something about liability insurance and budget cuts before politely declining. The world, it seemed, had little space for quiet acts of generosity that didn't fit neatly onto a ledger sheet. By the third week, Allison sat alone most afternoons, sipping cooling tea and thumbing through her textbooks, the pages heavy in her hands. She told herself she was preparing, just in case someone came. She told herself that even if no one came, the preparation mattered. But even small hopes are made of fragile glass. One crisp morning in late October, she set up her table in the park once again. A basket of sharpened pencils, a few battered grammar books, a box of cookies wrapped in wax paper. She sat there until the sun began to dip and the air turned sharp enough to bite. No one came. Not Tyler, not Sophia, not the younger children who used to scramble to show her their drawings and math worksheets. Just the slow drifting of golden leaves, and the whisper of a cold wind through the empty swings. Allison packed her things methodically, as she always did. She brushed the crumbs from the table. Folded the chairs. Tucked the pencils away one by one. She loaded her worn book bag onto her shoulder and took one last look at the empty space where hope had once gathered. It would be easy, she thought, to let bitterness in. Easy to blame the parents who hadn't supported their children's needs, the officials who hid behind rules and policies, the townspeople who valued peace and quiet over the noisy business of growth. But bitterness was a slow poison. And Allison Marsh had spent too long cultivating something stronger inside herself. She walked home beneath a sky streaked with the first sharp stars of evening. Her breath misted in the air. Her steps were steady, even if her heart was heavy. There would be other places, she told herself. Other children who needed someone to notice them. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday. Because the truth she carried inside her, deeper than loneliness, deeper than defeat, was this. Kindness was not wasted just because it went unseen. Kindness, like seeds scattered by a careless hand, sometimes took root in the places she would never see. Sometimes, it simply needed time. And so, though the world around her seemed indifferent, Allison Marsh kept walking, carrying her bag of battered books like a torch through the gathering dark. It happened quietly, almost too quietly to notice. One gray November morning, as Allison sat by her window, tracing the rim of her coffee mug with a slow, absent hand, a knock sounded at her door. It was Darryl. He stood awkwardly on the landing, a paper invitation held in both hands, like a child offering a fragile thing he didn't know how to protect. "We're having a little event at Sunny Brew this Saturday," he said, words hurried and tumbling over each other. "Would be nice if you came. You know, just for old time's sake." He didn't meet her eyes, and before she could answer, he had pressed the invitation into her palm and disappeared down the stairs. Allison turned the card over. No details. Just the cafe's name, the date, and a short note handwritten at the bottom, "Please come. It's important." She considered it for a long while. Her heart, bruised and cautious, whispered that it might be easier to decline. To stay in her apartment with her tea and her silence. But a different voice, a voice forged from years of perseverance and unseen kindness, said otherwise. When Saturday came, Allison dressed in her best again. The same cardigan with the tiny pearl buttons, her hair pinned back neatly, her bag of textbooks slung across her shoulder more from habit than necessity. She stepped into the chilled morning air and made her way toward sunny Brew, her breath puffing little clouds into the frosty sky. The bell above the cafe door chimed as she entered. And the world stopped. Inside, the tables had been pushed aside, and the small space was filled, absolutely filled, with faces she knew. Children she had taught, now standing a little taller, holding homemade signs that read "Thank you, Miss Allison." Parents lining the walls, clutching each other's hands. Even some of the old regulars from the cafe, the ones who once frowned at her lessons, now stood with lowered eyes and somber faces. At the center of it all, standing just beneath the faded chalkboard menu, was a man she did not recognize at first. He wore a simple navy jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, but as he stepped forward, there was something familiar about the way he moved. A careful grace, as if every step carried a memory. He removed the cap, and Allison saw a face aged by hardship but softened by gratitude. "My name is Adam Blake," he said, his voice carrying steady through the cafe. "You don't know me, Miss Marsh. But I know you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Adam smiled, a small, almost broken smile. 25 years ago," he continued, "I was a boy sitting on a church step with a third-grade reading level, pretending I didn't care. You sat down beside me. You didn't scold me, didn't lecture me. You just started reading out loud, and didn't stop until I joined you." He paused, his throat working visibly. "You taught me how to believe in myself when no one else would. When I had no home. No hope." The room was so silent that even the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed to fade away. "I built Blue Nova Systems from the ground up because someone taught me that a broken start doesn't mean a broken life." Adam reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "I'm proud to announce the creation of the Allison Marsh Foundation," he said. $60 million, dedicated to providing educational support to underprivileged children across this country, starting right here in Laredo. Gasps filled the room. Someone in the back began to cry softly. Adam stepped aside, and a second man entered, carrying a plaque. In raised gold letters, it read, "The Allison Marsh Educational Center, because every child deserves a chance." The abandoned town theater, the once crumbling relic no one had the heart to tear down, was already being transformed. It would reopen in the spring, a place of light, of laughter, of learning. And it would bear her name. The woman who had once sat unnoticed in a corner with her worn textbooks now stood at the center of a town forever changed. Darrell wiped his eyes openly, unashamed. The customers who had once complained stood in quiet rows, guilt and admiration painting their faces. And the children, her children, cheered, their voices lifting toward the rafters. Allison stood very still, her hand pressed lightly to her chest, feeling her heart beat against her palm as if it, too, couldn't quite believe. Later, when the speeches ended and the crowd slowly began to disperse, Adam pressed something into her hand. A single coin. An old Army Challenge coin, worn smooth by time. "For strength," he said simply. "For what you gave me when I had none." Allison closed her fingers around the coin. And for the first time in a long while, she wept, not from loneliness, not from defeat, but from a joy too vast to contain. In the weeks and months that followed, the town of Laredo began to breathe differently. Children who once drifted through classrooms unnoticed now excelled. Families that had considered leaving stayed. New businesses opened. Hope, once fragile and flickering, became something sturdy enough to build a life upon. Allison continued to live in her small apartment above the pharmacy. She continued to walk to Sunny Brew, carrying her battered book bag, her heart lightened but not changed. Each morning, she sat with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunrise catch the gold letters of the new educational center across the street. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she would trace the coin in her pocket with her thumb, a quiet reminder that kindness, even when forgotten by the world, never truly vanishes. It blooms. It builds. It saves. Because kindness without question is enough. Always.